You are listening to Middle East Monitor Conversations, bringing you lively discussions with prominent voices from the region and beyond, as we delve deeper into issues shaping the Middle East and North Africa, from politics, the culture, and the arts.
Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt. 12 million people were taken as slaves from Africa to the Americas, coming from different societies, speaking different languages, worshipping different religions, and coming from different professional backgrounds. Millions were forced into hard labor, which left many dead or injured. The legacy of slavery still impacts us now and animates many of our debates. Anxiety over slavery is nothing new, and during the antebellum period in America, an extraordinary figure appeared, Omar ibn Said, who was a slave and a scholar. His written accounts caused a sensation at the time. A new book, I Cannot Write My Name, Islam, Arabic, and Slavery in Omar ibn Said's America, which explores his life and works, and this is our topic today. The book's authors, Mbaye and Ernst, joins us today. Mbaye is an associate professor of practice of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies and International Comparative Studies at Duke University. Originally from Senegal, Lo completed his undergraduate and graduate training in classical Arabic language and literature at the International University of Africa, Khartoum, and Khartoum International Institute for Arabic Language, Sudan. He has also received an MA in American History from Cleveland State University, where he has earned his PhD from the Maxine Goodman Leavened College of Urban Affairs, with a dissertation on reinventing civil society-based governance in Africa, theory and practice. Ernst is a specialist in Islamic studies with a focus on West and South Asia. His published research, based on the study of Arabic, Persian and Urdu, has been mainly devoted to his study of the three areas: general and critical issues of Islamic studies, pre-modern and contemporary Sufism, and Indo-Muslim culture. He has received research fellowships from Fulbright programs, the National Endowment for Humanities, and John Simon Guggenheimer's Foundation, and he has been elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. His most recent books are I Cannot Write My Name, Life, Islam, Arabic and Slavery in Omar ibn Said's America, co-authored by Mbaye, and Breathtaking Revelations, The Science of Breath, from the 50 Kamra Pour verses to Hazrat Inyat Khan, co-authored with Patrick De Silva. Mbaye and Carl, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you.
And it's our complete pleasure to have you. As you know, I've read the book and I've done a review of it, which can be found on Middle East Monitor's website. It was a real pleasure to actually be able to engage with this work. It was such a fascinating insight into his life, and it's really, on one hand, it's kind of egregious, some of the stuff that was coming out, because of course, as you guys highlight in the book, his biography has been deliberately, in many cases, misinterpreted to serve certain agendas. And his words are sort of taken out of context to support certain things. And so it feels as if, going on close to 200 years after he's written some of these words, it's finally coming to us. So it was a very important, read from that perspective. But I would like to start, right at the beginning. Perhaps you could tell us who Omar ibn Said is and why does he matter? That's for either who wants to take it.
Well, briefly, we could summarize the events of Omar's life as beginning with his birth in 1770 in West Africa, what is now Senegal. He studied in seminaries in Futa Toro and Bundu for 25 years, he tells us. And he was captured in war and sold into slavery in 1807 and ended up in South Carolina, in Charleston. After a couple of years, he ran away from there and went to Fayetteville, where he was thrown into jail and subsequently enslaved by a very wealthy family called the Owens. And he remained a slave for over 50 years until his death in 1863. During that time, he wrote a number of compositions in Arabic, which have been completely misunderstood until today. And so it has been an extraordinary journey for us to enter into the world of this man and to see how he preserved his learning in Arabic under the most difficult conditions. That's a very quick overview. Mbaye, would you care to enlarge on that?
I may just add a few notes. And Usman, many thanks for inviting us to share our work and reading and understanding of Omar Ibn Said. And Carlo did give us just the main framing of Omar's life. But it is also the story that we wanted to tell. It is just a story of resistance and resilience of an enslaved person. And we don't have many such a story currently. And the story also written by the person himself. So we don't have, except Omar's document, we don't have any other enslaved person who wrote his life while in slavery. So Omar really stands out unique among this group of enslaved categories. Add to that also, I think it is very important, as in America, as we struggle with modern societies about the burden of slavery, its ramification in our daily life. And you are aware of the protests a few years ago, Black Lives Movement and so. So I think as we try to figure out how to move forward collectively for the sake of our humanity, we also need to go back to read this existing documentation of what has happened. Because Omar was both a witness and a victim of racism in America. So I think all this combined, we can understand why Omar is very important and why it is relevant to our daily life.
Yes, it says you. Sorry, go ahead, Ernest.
I would also add that this is a local story for us. It's a story about North Carolina and South Carolina and about the University of North Carolina, where I taught for 30 years, because the Owen family included the person who enslaved him, Jim Owen, and his brother, John Owen, was a student at the University of North Carolina and remained a trustee of the university for over 20 years. So his name is literally inscribed into the Memorial Hall of the university. So we feel very much a responsibility as citizens of our state and our academic world to set the record straight. And that has been a tremendous experience.
Feels like there's a question there to talk about how the university feels about all of this over time, but we'll come back to that in a moment. And because I still want to backtrack a little bit, because of course we're talking about a series of writings he did, which includes a biography written about his life, autobiography, something he's able to write. And at the time he does this biography, there's a kind of amazement about it, right? Could you perhaps Dr. Lowe, you could tell us, what was this amazement? Why were people so fascinated by the appearance of these writings?
Well, there is a story about Omar's writings. The autobiography was written in 1831, and the first translation came in a few years later. And the second translation was published in 1863, the year of Omar's passing. And the third translation, few decades later in 1925. And the fourth translation, actually, a couple of decades, or less than 2 decades ago in 2011. So there's an evolving story about Omar's autobiography during his life after his passing. But he wrote other documents. In the book, we talk about 18 documents that we found in local and national libraries written by Omar. The first writing of Omar goes back to 1819. That was a letter that he wrote to his enslavers, the Owens family or the Owen brothers, asking, among others, to be returned to Africa. This was never translated during Omar's life. It was just translated maybe 3 decades ago. So what Omar was asking was never translated. But what he was asking in the letter was to be returned to his village, and he will give the name of the village and Africa itself. So here's the story, though. The obsession with Omar before the Civil War of 1861, and even after the Civil War, has to do with Omar not wanting to be returned to Africa. Yeah. While his first writing in America that we have available, central to the argument in that paper was, I want to be returned to Africa. Yeah. So inability of these enslavers to decipher Omar's document, to read what Omar wrote, was a source of tension and obsession with this person. So Carl talks about Omar being recaptured in 1810 in Fayetteville. When he was repossessed, because he was a runaway slave running from Charleston, South Carolina to North Carolina, he was captured and jailed. In the jail, he was writing on the wall. He used the charcoal available in the jail cell and started writing in the wall. But no one in the jail system, no one in town would understand what he was writing about. Yeah. So the story was, we have a writing Negro who can write. It's very important because these echoes contradict the very claim of the peculiar institution of slavery, which was, we're civilizing enslaved people who cannot read or write. So the mission of slavery was to enlighten a person who cannot write. But here you have a person writing. And this was, I think, attracted the Owen families, who was very wealthy, to invest in this person. So your question about obsession with Omar has to do with this existing tension that we're enslaving a category of people because they can't read, they can't write, they have no religion, and the existence of a person who can write, educated, and a person who manifestly talks about his religion as a Muslim. So here also comes another point, which is central to Omar's image, is his conversion to Christianity. So you look at Omar's life that we have. He spent 10 years in the Owens family before he declared or converted to Christianity. So you have 10 years of pressure on this enslaved person to convert, and he ended up converting to Christianity accordingly. But in the book, we argue that Omar was not a convert, but he was just a Muslim in church, which could be understood. So you have all these implications. Converting a Muslim to Christianity is very highly marketable among supporters of the peculiar institution. Also, having an educated Muslim who can, educate us about Africa, about where he came from, also was another supportive element. So all this combined together, I think, created this existing tension around Omar, obsession about Omar during his life and after his passing in 1863.
Dr. Ernst, from reading these writings, is there any sense then that he wants to be writing this? Is there any sense that he's being made to write this? And if so, how is this situation that he's in influencing what he's saying?
Well, he was a scholar. He was trained in the memorization of numerous theological texts. And one of the things which scholars do in that tradition is to teach and to heal. And so his writings can be understood in part as sermons, which are directed at his white enslavers, in which he frequently quotes the Quranic verses which attack the arrogance of the wealthy. This is unmistakable. And it's as if he is treating them as if they were Muslims, but they are unable to understand his message. So we regard his writings as a kind of message in a bottle, something that has been cast upon the seas of fortune in search of an audience. He also was writing documents that were talismans, amulets, if you like, containing geometrical representations of the names of God. And these were meant for the healing and protection of especially the children of the Owen family. So he wrote because that's what he was trained to do. But he was also writing because he was told to do so. And he was brought out as if to do a parlor trick for visiting luminaries. And they would say, Omar, why don't you write out something from the Arabic version of the Bible for Reverend so-and-so? And he would comply. And he is described in a number of encounters of this type, where there is a kind of a romanticization of him and a description of his dignity and his bearing and his mannerisms and so forth. So he was shown off as a kind of a trophy to demonstrate how wealthy and important the Owens family was, and also as a demonstration of the benevolence of slavery. Because if it could be shown that he had converted to Christianity and did not wish to go back to Africa, that was proof that slavery was a benevolent institution, which was very much in the interest of these people. So the other place where we find an instance of coercion is in the so-called autobiography, where he begins with a statement, which is the title of our book, I Cannot Write My Life. He says he addresses a person he calls Sheikh Hunter, who is, we presume, one of the ministers who were acquainted with the Owen family. And he says, Sheikh Hunter, you have asked me to write my life. I cannot write my life. As Mbaye has remarked, Omar was the only person who wrote a document of a personal narrative about enslavement, who did so in the condition of slavery. Every one of the other authors who wrote before the Civil War, approximately 100 such slave narratives, wrote from the perspective of having been freed. But what kind of freedom does a slave have? And how can he write his life if his autonomy is taken away? So not only that, he knew that people couldn't understand his language adequately. And moreover, there was an earlier narrative, which he had apparently written in 1825, which was entrusted to the learned societies of Philadelphia and which was lost. And so he had good reason to suspect that people really didn't care what he wrote. So there is something very paradoxical about his agency and his authorial voice in this text. And he rewrites every episode so it exists in two separate versions of each incident, as if to say that there is no way that he could actually describe it adequately.
And could you perhaps tell us, what do we know about his experience, Dr. Ernst? What do we know about his experience of being enslaved? Do we know how he was specifically treated in the Owens family? Do we know much about his day-to-day life there?
Well, we have to be careful in evaluating the sources, because practically everything that was written about him during his lifetime was a lie, as far as we can tell, when we measure it against his own writings. But he was apparently treated relatively well according to the standards of slavery. He was not made to work in the fields. He was, as it were, in the house, and he's described as having had a boy attendant, and he himself describes his treatment as good, although I think there's some irony in his words. He's not saying everything that he knows. But we don't know anything really about his interaction with other enslaved people, because his writings are all addressed to the white enslavers. And this is different from some of the other enslaved scholars, such as in Panama, Sheikh Senasi, who writes to the Muslim men and women, the believing men and women, and tells them about the kinds of practices which they should perform. So Omar is in a very different position. And therefore, we have to read between the lines and do our best to estimate what his situation was. But in many respects, his life will remain impossible to discover in its full texture because of the complete incommunication between him and his enslavers.
Dr. Lowe, so we've also
Yeah,
heard
I will just add to that. How do we understand Omar's life? We do through two sources: what Omar wrote about himself and what was written about Omar. What was written about Omar is extensive. J.J. Watson wrote in 1803 that Omar, no one was written about in the years prior to the Civil War. No Negro was written about more than Omar ibn Said and Booker T. Washington. So Omar was extensively covered and talks about prior to the Civil War and during his life and after his life. So in our findings, we look at what was written, reported. Every single element of it was a lie. So this doesn't stand out. This was just how systematically the system adopt a particular language, a particular frame of thought in order to justify slavery. So in that context, Omar was used when he writes by not translating what he writes, by mistranslating it. So we call him Omar ibn Said because the first translator in 1836 couldn't read the word Sayyid. But Omar, in all his documents, his name is Omar ibn Sayyid. But the mistake from the first translator that just evolved with all the four translators, read as Omar ibn Said. Yeah. And others. Every single document that Omar wrote, he starts, if you fully get the document, he starts with in the name of Allah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, and he ends up by signing his name. Yeah. But enslavers were not interested in what Omar was writing. They were just interested in the image of having an enslaved Muslim scholar. And they used that in support of the warring group at the time prior to the Civil War, the abolitionists and pro-slavers. But what about what Omar wrote? That is very important. That's also another source of knowledge about Omar. So Omar was a slave. And a major recurring question yesterday and today is, can the slave talk? Can the slave write? Is there a freedom of writing agency in slavery? Frederick Douglass told us earlier in 1850s that no, the slave can write, but the problem is with the free man. The free man cannot read what the slave writes. Because in slave writing, you need gap and omissions. Those existing gaps and omissions are speech, but that speech, a free person cannot understand it. So we incorporate these gaps and omissions in our attempt to understand Omar and give meaning to his writing. If you look at Omar's example, he talks more about the Owens, his enslavers, more than about himself. Yeah, people today knows Governor 24th of North Carolina, which is John Owen, more than we know any other governor during his lifetime, because he was the brother of the enslaved of Omar. And Omar always praised him. So he became very known in the academia. But we know little about Omar. Omar, in his autobiography, talks about this way. My name is Omar ibn Said. I was born in Futa Toro. And I spent 25 years studying Islamic knowledge. I spent years in Bundu. My sheikh were my brothers. He gave their two names. After I returned from this journey, one day, an army of infidel, invade our village, kill a lot of people, and enslave me, sold me to the Christian, Nasara. Christian in the parlance of West African means white, because it was the European missionaries who introduced Christianity to West Africa. Therefore, the word Nasrani as Arabic in Quranic language becomes, associated with whiteness. So only in the late last century did West African Arabic writers shift to using French, British, and so on. So that is the language Omar used. Nasara, he means white. They sold me to the Nasara. They took me to across the sea. And Omar will tell us it lasted for a month, and he came to Charleston. He talks about it. He was sold to a person that he described as very violent, very bad, very weak, very small physically, and who has no fear of God. For 2 years, Omar engaged in heavy labor in Charleston. I think this background is extremely important psychologically. Once Omar escaped 270 miles from Charleston to Fayetteville, I'm sure he's been helped by the Underground Railroad, others ancillary people, and free Black. And he came to the Owens. They treated him in a better way. So here is very important also, we understand Omar's trauma in Charleston for 2 years and relative ease that he got in Fayetteville, in Bladen County, where he resides. So that I think that is where the tendency to glorify the Owens came from. But even at the time, you can see when Omar talks about the people that he talks to in his autobiography, he talks about all Americans, all North Carolinians, all South Carolinians. And then he will shift to praising them. So because he can't speak, he can't talk about his mind. So this is the objective interpretation of why he cannot speak. But there are subjective interpretation that Omar tells us in the book, in his autobiography, when Hunter, James Hunter, more likely, or Eli Hunter, another, religious leader, asked him to write about his life. He said, "Oh, I cannot write my life." That is where we took the title from. And he repeated it twice. But he justifies it. He gives subjective justification that he's ailing health, his age, and the fact that he has forgotten his own language, let alone Arabic. So that is what he will give as justification. But despite all that, he will move on to write about his life in a way that a slave can communicate his or her feelings. So I think all these are important, and we used it in order to bring Omar's voice, to make him really understood by a modern person who is interested in a story that is meaningful, a story that is a story of resistance.
Yes, it's a very interesting story, because as you mentioned, he repeats this phrase a few times, "I cannot write my name." And I sort of got the impression from reading the book that you two have produced that there seems to be a number of meanings that we can attribute to what he means by this, because as you've said, on the one hand, he says, I can't remember my language, thus I can't write my name. I can't write my name because of my ill health. I can't write my story because of this. But he's also, sort of hinting at some other things as well. I mean, on the one hand, when I was reading, and this is just my impression, it feels like I'm reading something written by someone who's very, scholarly, someone who's very much in tune with, Islamic training because one of the features of that is modesty. You don't want to boast about yourself so much. And so I sort of read it as a kind of modesty as well, as a way of reasserting the ethics he was taught in. And so I'm wondering if we see other elements of that in the works.
Well, we do, and one of the features is the way that in the so-called autobiography, he writes about himself in the third person. About 80% of the time, he uses the third person to describe himself, and so we see this as part of an ethic that is from his Sufi training, which is connected to the kind of emphasis that we find in the poets that he quotes from, like Abu Madian, who tells the disciples that they should never claim to do anything right. They must always apologize for themselves. And so this kind of self-deprecation is a rhetorical device, if you like, of apologetic, which is appropriate for his position. But what's interesting is immediately after he says that he's forgotten his language and his Arabic, he quotes a theological text from memory, the Mukhtasar of Khalil, which is a fundamental text of theology and law for all of West and North Africa. And so he also, in the opening section, addresses a different audience beyond Sheikh Hunter. He addresses his brothers. He says, "My brothers, do not blame me." Who are his brothers? These have to be his colleagues from his theological training in West Africa. So he asks his brothers to not blame him. And then after he apologizes for his scholarly shortcomings, he quotes this from memory. And so anyone who had that background who would read this would immediately know that Omar was still there. And so one of the great discoveries for us was that he is quoting from Sufi poets, from theological writings that had been unrecognized previously, and which demonstrate that he was still following the practices of Islamic scholarship well into his 80s when he quotes some of these same texts. So this was something which was a real revelation, and I think it's so important because, circling back to the beginning of why we became interested in this project, the fact that a slave was educated somehow makes people feel worse about slavery. It shouldn't, really. But there has always been this feeling in America that, well, many of these people were illiterate from uncivilized societies, and so it wasn't that bad. This is a real hypocritical justification and not worthy of us. So we have to strip away the veil of that particular excuse and recognize that there were people like this, and we need to remember that. That's the purpose of our book.
And if I may add to that, it is extremely important to offer context and framing to this discussion and debate. I think for many years what was lost in translation was, how do we categorize slave narrative, or freedom narrative, as some may call it. So we know from historians and scholars of slavery that less than 100 autobiographies were written prior to the Civil War. The Civil War ended 1865, and then you have more ex-slave writing about their life. And then in early 1930, with the economic collapse in the US, there was a federal writers project, which was, in a way, how do you offer employment to academic and writers? So during this time, over 6,000 really slave narratives were collected. Ex-slaves were interviewed about their life as slaves. And then this discipline becomes more common, accepted in the American academia, with a good book about slave narrative in the American history, published really in 1989, but it was written as a doctoral dissertation at New York University following World War II. But if you look at all these writings, the argument they're trying to make was, and it is, that slave writing, slave narrative is just a development or extension of the European Enlightenment. It is a continuation of the sentimental novel. The European Enlightenment is about issues about reason, about liberty and freedom, about the limits of human, as Madison told us, human morality. We should not trust the morality of man for the mechanism of government, how to limit it. That's why we have separation of powers. So actually, slave narrative also written by enslaved people, ex-enslaved people, and edited mostly by white editors, was just a development of the European way of thinking politically. The autobiography, this type of autobiography. But if you look at Omar's writing, the more I think about it, Omar is writing, the autobiography did not develop in Muslim societies. Biography did develop as a science, but people did not write about their life. It has to do with what Carl was talking about, just the ethical implications of glorifying oneself. That's why when biographies developed in the 8th, 9th century, it was about other scholars. So I think this also plays out in Omar's writing. Because where Omar came from, whether it is the Sufi Abu Madian, which Omar Said, talking about or discouraging the disciple about writing or talking about themselves, that everyone has to memorize. Even Sheikh Ahmad Bamba in later years will write about it. وَلَا تَرَى الْعَيْبَ إِلَّا فِيكَ مُعْتَقِدًا أَيْضًا عَيْبًا بَدَا بَيِّنًا لَكِنَّهُ اسْتَتَرَ. Do not always assume there is something wrong about you. Imagining that aib, that limitation is apparent and everywhere, everyone can see it. Omar is manifesting that in his writing. And those who are familiar with Muslim ethic, from Ibn Malik to Sahnun and so on, it is required from the Imam, even if he's the appointed Imam, not to, when it's time for prayer, not to move forward and lead. He has to wait for someone from the audience to come and tap him on the back that you can go and lead us. So the very act of doing something because you define yourself as able to do it, or because you are asked to do it, is not enough. So this also play out in the local culture where Omar came from. There are a lot of saying that knowing start with admitting that you do not know. So we talk about Omar, one of Omar's teachers from Omar's village, saying, you will know when you know that you do not know. So as a marabu, as a sheikh, Omar is expected to perform not knowing. But when you come back to this, where Omar was sold in this post-enlightenment societies, that is weakness, that is not knowing. So that is why you will see when Omar, earlier translators, when they see Omar saying, I cannot write my life, they say, oh, he already said it, he can't do it. Therefore, he cannot, he's not able to do it. Yeah. So there is clash of cultures here, if you will, between someone who is performing his tradition, his culture, in order to do what he's asked about, and those pseudo scholars who will use that sentences in order to mistranslate or dismiss the very meaning and content of the document. I think this area also is extremely important. I think I'm hoping future scholars can go and really offer new framing of how we can read and interpret these competing documents.
Ernst, this feels like an opportune time to talk about the university here, because, of course, as you've mentioned, he's an affiliate of the university that you, both of you teach at. And so what was their attitude towards, Omar ibn Said, even before your project, going through history, of course, what was their attitude towards these kinds of works, and how has it shifted with, the change in social and political landscape?
Well, the university library at UNC has 3 of the documents that Omar wrote of the 18, and also 2 photographs of the 3 which exist. And so these were presented to the university by donors who were from the families of the Owens and their descendants. And so they, interestingly, most of the documents were preserved by the children of the Owen family. A lesser number was preserved by scholars, and then a small number by collectors. And we know of at least a dozen other documents which are described in published works, but which seem to have been lost or disappeared. So the university missed the opportunity to purchase the autobiography when it went on sale in the 1990s. It was lost for over 75 years, but remarkably came back into light. But we're happy to notice that while we were working on the research, a document was discovered which was previously unknown and which came on the market and is now the most recent acquisition in the UNC libraries. And so I'm happy that they were able to take care of that properly. But John Owen, the brother of Jim Owen, the enslaver of Omar, as I mentioned, was a student at the university in 1804, just for a year. And he left during a kind of a revolt of the students against the authority of the professors. And then he became a trustee. We presume for that reason that there may have been occasions when Omar was present on the campus. And much of the construction of the university in its early stage was done by slave labor, obviously. And this is being documented as we come to grips with this part of our past in ways which were previously kept submerged. So this is kind of a coming to terms with history and honesty, which is slowly being worked out. But as we all know, there are people in the United States who do not wish to have a reckoning with the history of racism. They wish to pretend that it didn't really happen, or that it wasn't very important. And so they don't wish to hear about these stories. That's a mistake.
Yes, and Dr. Lowe, obviously America has undergone some very, we've had high-profile incidences in the last few years. We've had, for example, of course, Black Lives Matter initially in 2013, 2014 initially, and then in 2020 with the famous George Floyd killing. And there was a sense that there was going to be a kind of reckoning at the national institutional levels, obviously not from the then political administration, but certainly from the universities. And so I'm wondering, what kind of impact, measurable change did you see in the attitudes from university authorities to dealing with difficult issues such as slavery and their role in it?
Well, when you talk about university, you talk about universities. You have close to 5,000 universities, colleges, and community colleges, and so on in the US. So there is no unified attitude measurable in terms of how universities respond to this question. But I, as an academic and someone who works also beyond the US, I always tell my students, when you look at progress, you can only offer answers comparatively. Otherwise, we will always be digesting our own feeling and subjectivity. So we can look at what is happening in the US university or universities, comparatively with what is happening in other global universities in terms of reckoning with the past, whether it is slavery, whether it is colonialism, whether it is ism, so on. We can also look at within how far we came along with it. So in both ways, I think there are some progress, because progress is both, is as a leading African American scholar told us, is pull and push. Yeah. So you need moments of push and moments of pull. In terms of universities in the US, you can look at top schools, universities, which produce about 40% of the PhDs and the professors. So these are top leading universities. I think, generally speaking, they have responded positively to the call of reckoning with the past. Yeah, from Harvard to Princeton to Duke to UNC Public University to University of California, so on. You can see some institutional change that is trying to address the call for change. But in American history, I always argue that change is not coming from, it's coming from the bottom up. It always comes from the Black Lives Movement of today, or the Civil Rights Movement of yesterday, and the post-slavery movement of 1880s. So always it is the African American drive for change that what push, because this is a country that was built by businesses. In the administrative state, we will learn, this is a classical textbook, that the US is the only country that is really developed and built by the public sector. Yeah. So in order to change this society, the driving forces has to come from the bottom up. And I think historically we have seen how African-American movements come about imposing these changes. The change is not only benefiting them, but it's benefiting everyone. Newcomer, that I think that's extremely important. The difference between Europe and the US is any immigrant coming to the US can always find a footing in society, because most of the ways of changing were already set by African American. You can't find that in France. You can't find that in the UK. You can't find that in Germany. So these are the two images. We have to accept there is change going on, tremendous change in the academia, more opening for minorities, whether it is for women in particular, more opening to teach ideas that were not available, adopting issues of race and addressing slavery, and calling for how do we address the past and its ramification in the jail system, its ramification in the homelessness and existence. I think academics are leading this change and they're bringing it up. And at the other end, also you have negative forces that are always opposing changes. This is across the South and the North. It exists in universities, it exists in private sector as well as in the public sector. So going forward, I'm extremely optimistic when I look at this comparatively to what is happening overseas and comparatively to what we have done in previous decades.
And there's an important cultural element in this connection, which we should highlight, which is the opera Omar, which was written by the well-known musician Rhiannon Giddens with collaboration with Michael Abels, and which won the Pulitzer Prize for Music this year in March. And so Mbaye and I have seen this production. It was commissioned at UNC's Carolina Performing Arts, and it was recently performed by the San Francisco Opera. And I was able to watch that on video, and it's a powerful rendition, and it's a real artistic achievement, and it's placing someone from the margins of our history into the cultural center. And so I think this is another reason for optimism. And we're very happy that some of our work has been drawn upon for that production.
Yes, it does feel like there is a massive cultural change happening. But speaking of, cultural changes, I would like to sort of turn to the last part of this discussion a little bit briefly to talk a little bit about West Africa itself, because it does feel as if when it comes to thinking about this word, the Islamicate, which is a term academics use to describe civilizations and cultures where Muslims are the majority or form a huge part of the socio-economic and political sphere of of a place being described, it does feel that West Africa's contributions and what it was is overlooked quite a bit. and there does seem to be general ignorance about what, Islam's history in West Africa is. So I'm wondering if you could tell us, because obviously it's very pertinent to the story of Omar ibn Said, could you perhaps, give us an idea of what, the Islamicate in West Africa is and what it's, the societies there are like?
Right. That is, Carl can also talk about this. But there is a very unfortunate, one of the ramifications of colonialism is the marginalization of Africa. And Sheikh Anta Diop talks about this in pre-colonial Africa or pre-colonial Black Africa. And you find it not only in the European literature from Karl Marx to Hegel, who argues that Africa has no chapter in the history, no chapter in the book of history. I mean, Africa has no chapter in the book of history. It's a towering European intellectual. This also plays out in writings about Islam, writings about Muslim by Muslim or by Westerners. Only in recent years did we find room to talk about Africa and Islam. But if you look at it historically, actually, from Mecca, the Prophet sent his followers to Habasha, to Ethiopia, before even Medina. So the Africa's connection to Islam did not start with colonialism, but was there from early on. If you look at it, I always think framing things can help us have a better understanding of it. But in the written history of Africa as we have it now, we have the Ghana Empire from the 8th to the 13th century. And al-Bakri, who is an Arab Muslim scholar, visited Ghana and visited its capital city, Kumbe Saleh, and wrote about it in Masalik wal Mamalik, Roads and Kingdom. That is one of the towering history book. And he wrote about his visit to the Ghana Empire. And after the end of Ghana Empire in the 12th century, you have the Mali Empire. They overlapped for a century, and the Mali Empire came. Mali Empire, we all know about Sunjata Keita, the tremendous work we talk about in the book earlier on, and the rise of Sunjata Keita, and then Mansa Musa coming in the 13th century, visiting, going up north, east to Egypt and for Hajj to Mecca. And then a year later, you have overlap between the Mali Empire and Songhai. And in 1591, you have the Moroccan invasion of Songhai. That was the end of it. References in this book, in this area, also are available in oral history as well as in Leo Africanos, talk about the end of Mali. And Asadi's book, Tariq Sudan, which is translated, available, also talk about. So when you read these primary references, Islam and Islamic cultures were central into the making of the West African experience. So these are not something new. And then you have the rise of the transatlantic slave trade, devastating in terms of psychology, culturally, and economically of the region. By late 17th century, you have the rise of Islamic theocracies in West Africa to offer answer. I think that's an area understudied, because the success of Islamic theocracies that developed in late 17th century in Futa, Toro, where Omar came from, in northern Nigeria, where Usman Danfodio came, in Futa Jalon, we more likely Omar visited Futa Jalon and so on, because they were offering, and some scholars have written about this, actually answered in how to protect people from enslavement. We talk about in the book that the leading figure of the imamate polity in West Africa, imamate polity was in Futa and Bundu as well, was Muslims should not be enslaved. Yeah. And this was communicated and written and sent to the French representative in Saint Louis. So a rich debate developed during this time about the transatlantic slave trade. And currently available documentation, books by Musa Kamara, which is available translation, an Arabic translation, a French translation is available. We have the Arabic document published partially, but it talks about this rich tradition of Islam in West Africa during the end of the 17th century. So here comes, that is the moment Omar was captured in 1807. So So that was the end of the imamate. And you have the end of the international slave trade, but the national slave trade in the West, in the US, exists until the end of the Civil War. Then you have the era of colonialism. This is extremely important. Prior to colonialism, Islam was mostly associated with ruling families. So it was the elite who were mostly Muslims, the marabouts, the scholars. But Islam spread during colonial time. I mean, Musa Kamara wrote a book in Arabic called Aksarul Raghibin fil Jihad. He started writing in 1887 and finished it, after the end of World War I, in which he argued that one thing good that the French did was they actually helped support the development of Islamic courts in West Africa. Yeah. So if you look at now, a common belief is Islam becoming the popular religion, over 90% in West Africa, or Senegal, Mali, Guinea. That has to do with the French, because the way they establish Islamic court also empower religious and Islamic group to spread Islam. So there is a rich tradition of Islam in West Africa that did not start with colonialism, but prior to the colonial era. In 1802, a leading Senegalese scholar would write, Mali li Baghdad shawqun la wala fasi, lakin li zikra bawal qad bi'tu anfasi. Just beautifully long poetry in which he's arguing that I don't need Baghdad, I don't need Fas, because Baghdad is the political capital in the traditional Muslim imagination. Fas is the spiritual capital in the Maliki West African Muslim imagination. Here he's arguing, I don't need them, but my heart and my mind is about Bawal, because he's arguing that the educational level, the development in Bawal is superior to those areas. And we have actually documented archival documentation report from French missionaries in West Africa writing that the level of education in Fouta and Bundu was superior to the level of education, literacy in Western Europe. This is not, this is European emissaries writing back to the Metropolitan report about how educated, literacy-oriented West Africans were. So I think this is left in translation. This richness of Islamic cultures was lost in translation. And in the first chapter of the book, I think there is a very good, highly recommended read that Carla and I discuss about these issues. Yeah.
And there was another important thing to consider, which was that Arabic literature in Africa was, to a certain extent, marginalized from the perspective of what we call the Middle East today. And that carried forward into the European scholarship on Arabic literature. So, for instance, in the history of Arabic literature written in German by Karl Brockelmann in the 1930s, he really gave short shrift to the Arabic writings of Africa. And so it took a whole new effort that was organized by Shano Fahy and others to create a separate series called The Arabic Literature of Africa, which came out in about 6 massive volumes, which are mostly just the titles of thousands of books. And so this shows us how impoverished the imagination of Europeans and Americans was about African culture. They did not have any clue about the existence of this vast literature in Arabic, and consequently in local languages, as we call them, Ajami, which are written in the Arabic script. And so, and when we turn to America, when you read about what is the history of Arabic in the United States, you will commonly hear that it was when the Syrian immigrants came in the 1890s to New York and started to have literary circles there, and leading to people like Khalil Gibran. Well, that's all well and good, but our evidence indicates that the Arabic is being used by Muslim scholars like Omar ibn Said is part of our history long before that. So we want to revise the understanding of African culture and Arabic literary culture as part of this whole project.
It's a sort of like last reflection. It's kind of interesting because, as Dr. Lowe pointed out, he referred, for example, to the abolitionist movements, which is traditionally taught to us as mostly a Euro-American movement towards abolishing slavery universally. But there was work by people like Dr. Rudolf Ware and Bilal Ware on, abolitionism beginning in West Africa, and he sort of traces it to the history of West Africa. And he wrote this book, I think, a few years ago, but it still seems as if, people who can do an entire, write entire books about the history of enslavement and the impact of slavery still don't pick up on works like this. It feels like it's not getting through to enough people. There is another history of abolitionism, that doesn't begin in Europe. And I sort of sometimes wonder whether I should ask him this if I ever get a chance, does he feel frustrated by all of that? Because it feels like now, for the first time, this sort of stuff is becoming more accessible, and still it's not cutting through. So what do you think that says about, us in the West?
I mean, that is a great point. And I'm aware of Bilal's work, Ware's work. He's a good friend, I should say. It is the work in Quran is a well-researched work based on collected evidence, which was missing in most of the studies. His ability to stay in West Africa, travels, study the language, and so it was just a groundbreaking argument and work. And I'm glad that people are responding to it. But the argument about abolitionist is very ancient in Muslim tradition. The question was, what are the limits of it? Should Muslim be enslaved? This was the earlier question, and then it was extended into non-Muslims. Should they be enslaved? Based on what? So there is an ongoing tradition about enslavement within Islam. I know by the 8th century, enslaving Muslim was rejected by all schools of thought. And the recurring question was, are there actions by a Muslim that can justify his enslavement? The only pending continuous argument for some ulama was only if he abducted Islam, if he leaves Islam, that can justify his enslavement. So these are ideas in the humanities. They don't die out. It is just a question of recurring. And in the structure of scientific revolution, we learn that in the humanities, ideas don't go away, whether good or bad. But in the sciences, and pure science, they died out. But in the humanities, they don't go away. In religion is central to the humanities. So once something adopted, it does not go away. So that's why you have recurring scenes of violence by some religious group, whether they're Muslim, Christian, Buddhist or so, because the idea has to recur when circumstances change. In Muslim circumstances, the same. In Morocco, there was a rich debate of should Black enslaved from the Sahara, and if they move to Morocco and became Muslim, should they be enslaved or not? And we have a very rich debate because Maulaya Ismail, who really unified Morocco in early 18th century, enslaved all Black in Morocco, whether they were Muslim, free or not, in order to build an army, which he did, which unified Morocco as we know it. But he was confronted by most ulama, they opposed him, but some ulama who supported him, they stand with him, and he wrote a letter actually to Al-Azhar asking Al-Azhar's opinion about that. What about in the context of West Africa? The same debate, because it was a Muslim debate. The argument among West African scholars was, and from Suleiman Bal to Abdul Qadir Khan wrote a very lengthy letter to the French governor telling them slavery is rejected and enslaving Muslim is not accepted. We don't know to what extent did Abdul Qadir Khan apply that principle to non-Muslim. This is an area of research that we need more people to work on it. But we have documented in history and oral history that enslaving Muslim was rejected. That is why you have a tremendous growth in seminary, Islamic seminary in West Africa, in Bundu, in Pir, and in Futa Jalon, because Islamic seminary were protected. Yeah. With the devastation nature of the transatlantic slave trade, no one was allowed to attack this Islamic seminary. Mungo Park, who was a British traveler, visited Bundu, and he said every single time in Bundu, there were no less than 500 students studying Islamic studies. So Bundu was a seminary where people come from different places. So what I want to say is, which is very important, is in the area of research. I think it is, it is a well-argued understanding of abolitionism, but we have to put in that general context that in the humanities, we differ on ideas. Some people may accept it as required by Islam, while other Muslims may disregard and disrespect that call. And that was true in West Africa.
Dr. Ernst, would you like to offer some final thoughts on this?
Well, I think one of the issues we've seen in recent scholarship that has attempted to deal with Omar ibn Said has been a kind of use of speculation about what he might have been thinking. And this has been done in the absence of a rigorous understanding of what he actually said in his writings. And so I think that to a certain extent, there was an overemphasis on the notion of abolitionism as a kind of theory that Omar might have been adopting, but we don't really see evidence for this. And contemporary cases that are comparable indicate that when Muslims in West Africa were enslaved, they asked for improvement of their circumstances, but they did not argue that slavery was to be rejected altogether because it was not really a widely held concept. And so we're reluctant to read into Omar's writings what we would prefer to see from the viewpoint of our own views of progress and liberation and so forth. So we don't want to overstate what the evidence allows us to do. And so I think we have to be rather cautious about that. Omar accepted his fate as his destiny, and he quotes Quranic and theological documents. So he felt that he was in America for a reason, and so he continued to do what he was trained to do as a scholar. And that's the way he was.
And if I just may add to that, this is I think that is the key point that Carla just made, which is we should not project our contemporary socio-political problems in our reading of Omar. From day one, we both agree not to do that. We won't allow the reader to read Omar's work directly. That is why we try to maximize the legibility of Omar's work. But if you look at the literature, current literature on Omar, there is what we call everyone's Omar ibn Said. There's those who makes Omar abolitionist, those who makes Omar someone who calls for the dialogue of religion, those who makes Omar the Christian, blah, blah, blah. So you have this everyone's Omar, everyone's interpretation of Omar. And remember Assad's argument that was very cautious about giving agencies to people who are subjugated to colonialism and slavery. I know in our social sciences, we are obsessed with giving agencies. Everyone has agencies. But when we do that, we lose our ability to understand accurately what had happened. There were losers and winners in the past. We should not go back and give everyone agency. Omar didn't have agency that makes him to stand for religious dialogue. But that is our understanding now in cultural studies, that everyone has agencies. So we are extremely careful and attempted to limit just ourselves from this, desire to empower first subjugated people and give them agencies that they were free to do whatever they want. They were not. Omar was not free. He was a slave.
Dr. Lowe, Dr. Ernst, thank you for talking to us over at MEMO Conversations.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having us. It was
And
really a pleasure.
to our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you would like to watch this one or other MEMO Conversations, please do go to our website. But please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.
This was Middle East Monitor Conversations, brought to you by the Middle East Monitor in London.